Max Verstappen won the Qatar Grand Prix, but his car wasn't even the fastest. Now the FIA has just released new race data that reveals what really happened. Red Bull made a setup change so risky, engineers thought the car wouldn't finish the race. Subscribe right now, because the championship could be decided not by speed but by this exact moment in Qatar. The Qatar Grand Prix looked like just another Verstappen win on paper, calculated, smooth, inevitable. But behind the scenes, something very different was unfolding. Red Bull had taken a risk that most teams would never attempt. A setup change after qualifying that pushed the car to its mechanical limits. And now, the FIA has confirmed the details that could change how this race is remembered forever. Verstappen's RB21 wasn't the fastest car on the grid in Qatar. It wasn't the most stable either. McLaren had better one-lap pace, Ferrari had more tire longevity. Red Bull knew it. So they gambled. They modified the rear suspension setup and park firm, sacrificing grid position for a shot at winning the race through balance, control, and tire flexibility. The FIA has now officially released the technical report and the numbers are shocking. What the FIA found wasn't illegal. But it was dangerously close to the edge of what's permitted in the regulations. The setup altered how the car handled rear tire load, making it more reactive and harder to control through long corners. On a circuit like Losail, where traction and heat balance decide the race, Red Bull essentially gave Verstappen a high-wire act. The slightest misjudgment in throttle or steering would have sent the RB21 sliding off pace or off track. But Verstappen didn't blink. He took that narrow operating window and lived in it for 57 laps. Lap after lap, his throttle traces were smoother, his brake points earlier, and his steering corrections nearly non-existent. The FIA's own telemetry shows that Max was controlling a car that, in theory, should have fallen off a performance cliff halfway through the race. Instead, he extended his tire life and undercut both McLarens with perfect timing. What stunned rival teams wasn't just that Red Bull made the change, it was that they gave Verstappen the freedom to handle it. McLaren and Ferrari both went conservative, aiming for predictability over peak performance. Red Bull, by contrast, trusted that Verstappen could handle a setup that was mathematically efficient but physically brutal. And it worked. Because he didn't fight the car. He bent it to his rhythm. Now, with just one race left in the season, this moment in Qatar takes on a much deeper meaning. Verstappen didn't just win, he shifted the psychology of the championship. Norris and Piastri weren't beaten by a faster machine. They were outthought and out-executed. Red Bull didn't rely on dominance. They relied on Max. And the FIA's bombshell has confirmed that it was all legal, just dangerously close to genius. So if you thought Qatar was just another routine win, think again. What happened behind the scenes reveals everything about how this championship has changed. And with Abu Dhabi looming, the smallest risk or setup call could decide the title. Subscribe now, because Verstappen isn't just chasing another trophy, he's rewriting how races are won. Coming into Qatar, all eyes were on McLaren. Lando Norris held the championship lead. Oscar Piastri had qualified strongly. And Red Bull? They looked uncomfortable. Verstappen's RB21 was unpredictable in the corners, slow in traction zones, and visibly difficult to handle during all three practice sessions. Analysts predicted a defensive drive a weekend where Red Bull would have to limit the damage and hope for a better final round in Abu Dhabi. But Red Bull doesn't race to survive. They race to win. And on Saturday night, they made a decision that shocked even some within their own garage. They chose to brake park firm, change the suspension geometry, and sacrifice grid position. It wasn't a reckless move. It was an act of surgical aggression and understanding that Max Verstappen could manage a more volatile car better than anyone else on the grid. The question was, would the gamble hold over race distance? Sunday's grid told only half the story. Verstappen lined up behind both McLarens, and the early laps were clean but quiet. Norris led. Piastri followed. Verstappen settled into third, keeping pace but not attacking. Then, it happened. A mid-pack incident brought out the safety car on lap 7. What looked like a minor event turned into the most decisive moment of the Grand Prix. Because Red Bull reacted faster than anyone else. They boxed Verstappen instantly. The plan was simple: give up track position, commit to an aggressive two-stop strategy, and rely on Verstappen to manage a stiff setup across tire stints with extremely narrow performance windows. McLaren stayed out. Ferrari hesitated. And in that one decision, Red Bull flipped the strategy board. What had started as a risky race became a controlled test of racecraft, and Verstappen began to execute it like clockwork. The race resumed with Verstappen behind cars he'd normally clear easily, but he didn't rush. He let the strategy breathe. As others chewed through tires, Max was managing gaps, saving battery, and extending stint life. His calm on the radio was surgical. He asked for sector times. He reported tire state without panic. He never questioned the plan, because he had already accepted the discomfort. And now, he was using it. What no one saw coming was how effective the plan would become. McLaren didn't pit under the safety car. They waited. And that delay forced them into compromised stints later in the race. Verstappen, meanwhile, moved forward with each lap, not from outright pace, but from mathematical precision. By the time the final stops came, he wasn't chasing the win. He was already controlling it. The rest of the field just didn't realize it yet. What made it all more remarkable was that Verstappen's car, by every Friday and Saturday measure, should not have been the race-winning package. But Red Bull saw a narrow path to victory, one that required perfection in execution, control in chaos, and complete trust in a driver's ability to walk the line between risk and mastery. And with the FIA's confirmation of the suspension change, we now know they weren't lucky. They were committed. When the FIA released the post-race data from Qatar, it confirmed what many insiders already suspected. Verstappen hadn't won because the car was dominant, he won because the strategy was surgical and the execution flawless. The first dataset that stood out was his lap time consistency. Verstappen was able to stay within 0.2 of his delta for over 30 consecutive laps. That level of control wasn't just impressive, it was statistically unmatched in the field, especially under high degradation conditions. Ferrari engineers reviewing public sector data noticed something that Red Bull had kept quiet all weekend. Verstappen's car was reacting differently in medium-speed corners compared to Friday. That confirmed the setup change. But what surprised them more was how Max adapted. In corners like turn 6 and turn 10, where most drivers were battling rear instability, Verstappen showed minimal correction in steering input. His corner entry speeds were slightly reduced, but his exits were flawless. He had traded aggression for flow. Telemetry overlays revealed a pattern: Max was braking earlier, but not slower. He was using the longer brake zone to manage longitudinal load, keeping the rear tires cooler while maintaining corner balance. This allowed him to preserve tire life without sacrificing lap time. Piastri, by contrast, was carrying more speed into the same corners but paying for it with traction loss and temperature spikes, data that explained his mid-race drop-off. Verstappen's balance wasn't perfect, but it was sustainable. Throttle traces added another layer of insight. Most drivers modulate throttle aggressively when managing rear grip. Verstappen, however, was linear. His inputs resembled a curve more than a staircase. That consistency helped prevent unnecessary spikes in tire surface temperature, especially crucial with the RB21's stiffer rear. While Norris had to back off mid-stint to recover grip, Verstappen extended his window, creating just enough strategic flexibility to make the undercut work when it mattered most. Even his energy deployment was clinical. The FIA's release showed Max saving ERS in sectors with limited passing potential, only deploying in key attack zones like the main straight in turn 1. That gave him the burst he needed when Piastri rejoined in front after the second round of stops. Within a lap, Max had the traction and battery advantage to breeze past, not by fighting, but by preparing. The overtake wasn't improvised. It was built across 10 laps of conservation. One of the most subtle yet decisive factors was tire wear distribution. According to the FIA data, Verstappen's rear left tire, typically the most stressed on Lusail's layout, degraded at a rate 0.3% slower per lap than Norris's. That difference sounds microscopic. But over a 57-lap race, it created a margin wide enough to push for an extra lap per stint. That was the gap that allowed Max to avoid traffic during his final stop. It wasn't about pace. It was about timing the rhythm of degradation. By the end of the race, the data told a story the podium didn't. Red Bull hadn't been the fastest, but they had been the most prepared. From the moment they broke park firm and changed Verstappen's setup, everything became about managing the risk curve. The telemetry shows a driver who wasn't on the limit, but just under it by design. The win in Qatar wasn't about dominance. It was about balance, and Verstappen was the only driver who made it look like that balance was easy. Red Bull's choice to stiffen the RB21's rear end for the Qatar Grand Prix was one of the boldest setup moves of the season. It made the car harder to rotate in low-speed corners and more sensitive to traction loss mid-exit. But what they gained was consistency, a platform that didn't shift as fuel loads changed, and a car that stayed balanced once Verstappen locked into the rhythm. It was a configuration that required trust, not comfort. Max Verstappen took that setup and molded his driving style around it. In sectors where the rear should have broken loose, he adjusted his inputs instead of forcing the issue. He rotated the car earlier into corners like turn 10 and smoothed the throttle application coming out. Where other drivers applied torque and bursts, Max delivered it in a single, controlled wave. That small difference was what kept the rear tires inside the thermal window. The brake bias tuning throughout the race was another masterclass. Verstappen altered his brake bias multiple times, depending on corner profile and stint length. Into turn 4, he moved bias forward to prevent rear locking. In slower hairpins, he shifted it rearward to help rotate the car. These adjustments weren't reactive, they were pre-programmed into his race plan. Red Bull trusted him to manage them independently, and it paid off in lap-to-lap consistency. Steering telemetry gave perhaps the clearest indication of Verstappen's control. In medium-speed corners, his steering inputs remained almost perfectly linear from lap 1 to lap 40. The RB21 wasn't easier to drive, it simply behaved the same way every lap, and Verstappen adapted to its behavior like clockwork. While others made mid-corner corrections, Max flowed through apexes with one input, limiting energy loss and preserving momentum. The ERS deployment strategy also played a key role. Verstappen used energy in short, deliberate bursts, not across entire sectors. This gave him maximum efficiency per deployment, helping him defend from undercuts and retake position after pit cycles. When McLaren attempted an overcut late in the race, Max had saved enough battery to respond instantly. The timing wasn't lucky, it was built into his race rhythm from the very first stint. Even his use of the car's differential settings evolved over the race. On lap 20, Verstappen tightened the diff to stabilize the rear through the twisty final sector. By lap 40, he opened it slightly to regain rotation as the tires aged. These changes were made manually, in real time, while battling lap traffic and calculating fuel use. Verstappen didn't just drive the RB21, he managed it like a second engineer on the track. By the final 10 laps, the result was clear. Verstappen wasn't winning because he had more grip, he was winning because he had more discipline. The RB21 was no longer a wild machine. It was perfectly neutral in his hands. Every movement, every gearshift, every corner entry had been shaped around one core idea: control the variables. And in a race where one wrong input could overheat the tires or destroy the balance, Verstappen made zero errors.